Micah Utricht. I am the managing editor of Jacobin magazine, and I want to welcome you all to Stay at Home. While people are still logging on, we'll give people a couple minutes here. Stay at Home is a video education project from Jacobin that we've launched during these quarantine months. You didn't have a whole lot of options of where you could go on a Saturday night, but we are grateful that you chose to spend your Saturday night with us here on Stay at Home. We have a guest for this series almost every night, usually at 6 p.m. Eastern, and the guest is usually a Jacobin contributor who will discuss an idea for about 25 minutes. And then we do a Q&A afterwards with our live YouTube audience. And so if you have a question for our speaker tonight, you can drop the comment, your question in the YouTube live chat, and we will ask our guest, or I will ask our guest your question. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, on Monday we're going to have Jacobin contributor Jared Abbott, and then Tuesday Dustin Guastella. Jared and Dustin both wrote two pieces together in our journal Catalyst, as well as our last print issue on their idea of a party surrogate. And so we'll be doing a two-part conversation, first with Jared on Monday, again at 6 p.m. Eastern, and then Dustin Guastella on Tuesday, talking about their recent pieces in Catalyst and in our print issue. Well, before Megan speaks, I just want to mention, we're not asking anybody for money during these sessions. Times are tough for many of you out there. What we are asking you to do, however, is to share the video once it, you can share it now on social media so that people tune in while it's live. You can share it after it's up once we're finished here. And we really would like to ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video. So tonight's Stay at Home is with Meagan Day. Meagan Day is staff writer at Jacobin. She is also a co-author of a book with me that just came out called Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, which you can purchase at jacobinmag.com/store. And Megan is going to be talking about why socialists should be a part of socialist organizations, in particular with an emphasis on the Democratic Socialists of America. So I am going to turn it over to Megan. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Micah. Thank you for the introduction. Let's just go for it.
Go for it.
All right, let's do it. So yeah, I was asked to give a presentation on why socialists should be part of a socialist organization. Socialist obviously is a kind of broad category. For our purposes, let's just say that a socialist is somebody who understands that capitalism is an inherently exploitative social and economic system, and that we should have another one that's predicated instead on principles of equality and democracy and solidarity. Some of the specifics might include that, for example, production should not should be run in a worker-controlled manner. So this is the sort of like generally what I mean by a socialist. So if you're watching this, this is for you if you're a socialist. So I think a lot of you probably are watching this and you are really bummed out that Bernie Sanders just lost the primary election. So he will not be the Democratic Party nominee. He will not be going up against Donald Trump, and he will not be the president of the United States. And because he's pretty old, he will not be running again. And so he will never be the president of the United States. I think if you compare the present situation to what could have been Bernie Sanders being president of the United States, it's really easy to become very demoralized. I completely understand that. It's I think it's necessary to acknowledge what we've lost. We've lost, for example, the chance to have meaningful climate action emanating from the White House, which is urgently necessary. We've lost the chance to have an appropriate response to the economic crisis that we now find ourselves being plunged into, emanating from the White House. Because even though Donald Trump and Joe Biden are quite different from each other, neither of them has the tools in their toolkit to actually get us out of this economic crisis without mass avoidable but unavoided suffering, right? And we've also lost the opportunity to have somebody in the White House who's just going to make a genuine effort to end the typical misery of working class life, the sort of protracted crises that predated this very acute crisis that we're in right now. And then that is all extremely bad news. And it's okay to feel bad about that. But it's also the case that you don't have to just compare the present moment to what we could have had with Bernie in the White House. You can also compare the present moment to if Bernie had not run. I think it's important to do that. And if you do that, you determine that, in fact, we have gained a lot. In the last half decade, having Bernie Sanders be a leader on the national stage and someone who could conceivably be the president of the United States, a self-avowed democratic socialist in a leadership position, in the highest leadership position in the beating heart of global capitalism, we have won a lot. Unfortunately, we haven't won many material gains, but we've won opportunities. And it's our responsibility to either seize or squander those opportunities. I think another way to look at that is that Bernie lost, but losing is not the same as failing, and it's not inevitable that he failed. So I think also I just want to start out by saying that there's a liberal tendency to sort of overinflate the importance of ideological victories, and I think we should avoid that. This is not all just a game of hearts and minds. That's liberals tend to say things like that. You know, the idea that if we just change people's minds, change what people think about things, then naturally society will follow. That's how progress is made. People sort of evolve in their understanding. And we know that's not true. But there is also a tendency on the left to, I think, completely discount the importance of transforming consciousness. People whose consciousness has been transformed become available to act differently. It's not inevitable that they will act differently, but that they become available in a different way to act differently. And that can set new material processes in motion. So if you are a socialist and you are concerned with setting new material processes in motion, I think that you should also be concerned with whether or not we just had a mass consciousness altering half-decade long event in American politics. I think that the answer is inarguably yes. It wasn't total, but it was pretty significant. So I think that, you know, the difference, Bernie lost, but he didn't necessarily fail. And the difference between whether Bernie lost and failed or lost but did not fail is how many people are activated by his campaign and beyond his campaign and what they end up deciding to do, how they end up deciding to act. Demoralization right now is the enemy of action. If we think that action is urgently necessary, then demoralization is going to convince people that they shouldn't act because there's no point in acting. So I think we should resist demoralization, even if we feel extremely bad, and it's okay to feel extremely bad. I think if you're serious about committing yourself to realizing the ideals of the Bernie Sanders campaign, you need to choose not to let demoralization win. And one of the ways that you can do that, especially right now, because it's possible that you are stuck at home. If you're not stuck at home, then you are working in an essential industry. And I very much hope that you are getting compensated appropriately. And I somewhat doubt that you are. And thank you for your service. But a lot of people are stuck at home and it's very hard to know what to do. And I think one thing that you can do, and you should do right now, if you haven't already, is you should join a socialist organization. You must under no circumstances be left alone right now. Well, I think it's important to, this message is geared toward Bernie supporters who are newly radicalized by the ideas put forward by his campaign and the realities of politics exposed by his campaign. And you're not yet a member of a socialist organization. And I think that you should be. This message also goes just as well, though, I think, for people who weren't brought into socialism by Bernie Sanders. I mean, some of you might be watching from overseas. Maybe you don't live in the United States. Some of you may have already been attracted to socialist ideas before Bernie Sanders, and so his campaign wasn't necessarily a watershed moment for you in terms of radicalizing you. But regardless, I think it's imperative that if you're not a part of a socialist organization, you take to heart the slogan that's frequently tossed around on the organized left. The slogan is that an unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms. I don't think that's a cliche. I think there's a lot of merit to that. You know, whether you're sitting around alone, like listening to left podcasts or sitting around alone and watching Bernie videos, or if you're a different type of person, if you're sitting around alone and reading the classics on Marxist.org, you're more advanced. It doesn't matter if you're sitting around alone. You are unfortunately not yet actually behaving as a socialist. You're behaving as a socialist sympathizer. You're behaving in a way as a fellow traveler. But socialism isn't merely an intellectual pursuit, and it's not merely a political identity. Socialism is a project of transforming the world, and socialists have a responsibility to actively advance that project. And in order to do that, you need to be a part of a collective, because by yourself, you're not going to be very efficacious. You need to figure out a way to multiply and extend your ability to act. And the only way to do that, which socialists have found over and over again, as have unionists and various other political actors, including political actors on the right and in the center, is to be a part of an organization, to join forces. And there are a number of reasons why. First, like I said, you can't meaningfully advance the socialist project on your own. You can't walk into a shop, for example, and say to the person working there, "Hey, do you have a union yet? You should really get a union." They'll be like, "Who are you?" And you'll be like, "I'm Fred, and I think you should have a union." And they'll just stare at you blankly. Like it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. On the most basic level, an organization is imperative to making political action coherent. And it's also imperative to maximizing the impact of that political action. Because even if you're Fred and you're extremely trustworthy, how many shops can you really go into, right? What kind of impact can you really have, even in whatever town you live in? And second of all, if you're sitting around alone, agreeing with socialists and consuming socialist texts and socialist media, the fact that you're sitting around alone at all means that you're not getting your hands dirty. In order to have any idea what's actually going on in the world, you really need to be out in the world. Even if you feel like you have a pretty good grasp on ordinary life, on like what a typical person thinks, because you live an ordinary life and you are a relatively typical person, you need to recognize that other ordinary and typical people live lives that look very different from yours. And the only way to know what's going on in multiple segments of the working class is to be in regular contact with lots of different kinds of people. Reading tweets, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos like this one, reading articles from multiple perspectives, that's not actually going to cut it. These are all filtered and mediated, and the information that you're going to get is going to necessarily be partial. And if you rely on these kinds of windows into what people are thinking, then your perspective is ultimately going to be distorted. The socialist theorist Gramsci said that a socialist's task is to be a permanently active persuader. So, how are you going to know how to persuade people if you don't really know what they already think? Marx famously said that philosophers have only interpreted the world and the purpose is to change it. But the task of changing the world is very difficult and it requires us to make a million decisions, large and small, which have to be carefully calibrated in relation to our actual political context. The canonical socialist and Marxist texts can give us some good pointers, but they also contain contradictory advice. And they were also written well before the present moment, which has seen some major modern developments politically, economically, technologically. So they can't really be relied upon to advise us precisely what to do at every single turn. In order for us to be able to act in the world and to effectively persuade people on a very large scale and set people into motion and set new material processes into motion on a very large scale, socialists need to have an instinctive haptic sense of their political context. And that can only be developed through practice. You have to have your finger on the pulse. And the best way to practice is to join an organization that works on a lot of different kinds of external facing campaigns with a lot of different kinds of people. That's one of the most important things that socialist organizations have to offer, is that they do full-time organizing, especially very active ones. And I'll get into the difference in a moment. But there are socialist organizations, including the one that I'm a part of, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is very dynamic and it's very active and it has chapters, all over the country, and it's engaged in a lot of different projects at any given time. It's also a multi-issue organization, which means that when it's not election season, it might be some season for some housing struggle or for some labor solidarity campaign. A socialist organization really fits the bill if you're looking to get your hands dirty. But like I said, I would get to this, not just any kind of socialist organization. It's got to be an active socialist organization, one that's not just a collection of people who already agree with each other, who mostly spend their time only talking to each other, or if they spend their time talking to other people, not doing so in a way that's actually particularly persuasive. I was talking to a DSA member and frequent Jacobin writer, Chris Maizano, who came on just a few days ago, 2 days ago, I think, to talk about Gramsci. And he compared some of the less active and less dynamic socialist organizations to a sort of monastic order. You know, you join and your job is to like receive and reproduce the holy texts. Socialists need to be out in the world, testing stuff out and learning through experience. A socialist organization that is dynamic and engaged in a lot of different kinds of political work, electoral and non-electoral, that's what you want. And for this reason, like I said, I would recommend that if you live in the United States, you consider joining the Democratic Socialists of America. And none of this, I wanna just make it perfectly clear, none of this is, of course, to downplay the importance of political education. Socialists need to read, and they need to understand what people before them have hypothesized and learned about the major questions facing their movement today. And here, of course, socialist groups are really the best place to go. They usually have reading groups that you can participate in, where you will be assigned things that you never even knew existed and certainly wouldn't have found to read. And if they're difficult, you'll be able to talk through them with other people. But most importantly, it's the combination of reading and action that produces a useful political education. The way that you can see what it that way you can see what it looks like to apply the concepts that you're reading about to the world that you live in, to see if they're appropriate or inappropriate for this or that political context. And there's another very important component of political education as well that I want to emphasize, and this again is ideally done alongside rigorous reading, and that's the practice of democracy. So you don't want to join a socialist organization that has no semblance of democracy, because then what you'll be missing out on is the ability to learn the skills of persuading other people, of being persuaded by other people, arguing for your position, being argued out of your position, arguing as hard as you can for your position, and then losing and accepting the loss gracefully and strategizing another way to get people to accept your position. This is how you get trained into being a permanent persuader. So democratic organizations are basically non-existent in our culture at large. This is one of the worst outcomes of the defeat of the left in most places around the world, including and especially the United States in the last 4 or 5 decades. There's so few institutions that remain in civil society that allow us to do these things like debate, decide, persuade, and collaborate with each other, accept losses gracefully, stand up for ourselves when we think that we're right, and really try to secure a win without being conflict avoidant, things like this. These are the skills that you develop in democratic groups. But, not only do we have so few democratic groups in our society, I mean, really, honestly, all I can think of that an ordinary person might be involved in is like maybe a group of, if you're a deacon at your church, you make decisions by Robert's Rules of Order. Like there just really are not spaces, unless you're in a union that happens to be particularly democratic, there are not spaces in our culture to practice these kinds of things, with the exception of democratic socialist organizations. And, one of these major skills is dealing with people that you disagree with. This is why undemocratic socialist organizations, ones that don't really do internal debate, are not going to help you develop the political education that you actually need. Because if you're just carrying out the decisions that are made by somebody else somewhere else, then presumably you and all the other people in your organization agree with each other. Or if you don't say anything about it. Or if you do say something about it, maybe you don't belong to the socialist organization anymore. And that doesn't teach you how to deal with people that you disagree with. And let's be honest, people are usually pretty conflict averse in most aspects of our lives. If someone like eats your special snack at work, you're usually like, wow, that was really rude. And you don't say anything to them about it because it's not worth the trouble. Practicing democracy in a socialist organization teaches us how to make tough calls in hard interpersonal situations. It basically re-socializes us. Our social sphere has been atomized and atrophied by neoliberalism and by the structures of our lives that separate us out from each other and encourage us to treat one another as obstacles rather than collaborators to individual success, not collective success. So socialist organizations can be democratic, and in the process of practicing democracy, you can actually develop a good political education, including learning when to compromise and when to stand your ground, when to pacify someone and when to ignore someone, and when to not let someone walk all over you, and crucially, when to listen to someone, when to admit that you were wrong and change course. All of this is really important outside of socialist organizations. Our social skills, like I said, are extremely limited, and we need to beef them up. And we need to do it in socialist organizations because people are difficult everywhere. A lot of times when people join a socialist organization that's democratic, they get turned off by the level of conflict. Sometimes there is high conflict. I've certainly experienced it. But I think one thing that they're missing if they walk out the door and go back into their life of not being a member of a socialist organization is that people are kind of difficult everywhere. And if you try to do things together, you're going to run into conflicts. I have friends, for example, who are very involved in their unions. People throw temper tantrums, people get mad at each other, you have to deal with difficult situations in contexts outside of socialist organizations too. The only time you don't have to deal with difficult people and difficult situations is if you're not actually organizing anything. So again, democracy is a major, major aspect of political education, and I would encourage people to join a democratic socialist organization. That is a socialist organization that is democratic. And the best example I can think of that, if you live in the United States, is the Democratic Socialists of America. And the last reason that you should join a socialist organization is that socialist organizations themselves are necessary and they need people in them to build them. So socialists know that our society is carved up into classes, and we know that conflict between classes is inevitable. But we also know that there is no automatic expression of class solidarity and class struggle. Class conflict is not really the same as class struggle. Class struggle is more concerted. Class struggle is often led and waged by people who have class consciousness, whereas class conflict might occur more naturally simply because people do not like being exploited and eventually they resist. So if there's no automatic expression of class struggle, that means that the people who are responsible for consciously cultivating class struggle are the people who are already ideologically committed to the project. And those people are called socialists. So if you're a socialist and you recognize that what I just said to be true, then you should join a socialist organization in order to help build socialist organizations, which can create new socialists and set socialists into motion strategically. And then a final note on this topic. I think this is something that doesn't get discussed quite enough. A socialist and a working class person are two separate categories of person. Socialism in this context describes a political ideology. Working class describes a location in the economic order. Not all working class people are socialists, obviously, and not all socialists grew up in working class households. I did not grow up in a working class household, but I identify as a socialist. So most socialist organizations, especially in the developed capitalist world, have historically, at their inception, been composed disproportionately of people who come out of the middle classes or higher. And this is for various reasons, but the most important one is that when the left is weak, socialist ideas are by definition not circulating in popular culture. And that means that it's unlikely that they're circulating outside of intellectual or academic environments, which are, of course, class selective. The task of socialists, though, is to merge the socialist movement with the working class. This has actually been done successfully a few times throughout history. One example would be the German SPD at its height, which did become a mass working class party. And another example would be the Russian Social Democrats, who drew lessons from the SPD on the importance of this task of merging socialism and the proletariat and managed to pull off a whole proletarian revolution out of it. It's it's not necessary. And they started, a lot of them started as student groups, frankly, and student groups, of course, very class selective in Russian society. So my point is that it's not necessarily fair to dismiss a socialist organization for not having already completed its historic task of merging socialism and the working class, two things that have been drawn closer together in when the left has been strong and have been disaggregated when the left is weak, by design, by capitalist design. However, it is completely imperative that socialist organizations themselves are, and socialists themselves are not content with separation from the working class, with idling in separate spheres, whatever class you come from. And I should say about DSA that while I think it is disproportionately middle class, or at the very least, the people who make up DSA disproportionately grew up middle class, though a lot of them are downwardly mobile. I think that you should see it. That DSA is actually disproportionately middle class, but that there are lots of people who are in DSA who are working class, and this is not to erase them. It's a very diverse organization. But whatever class you come from, if you are a socialist, you should see it as your task to facilitate that merger of socialism, a political ideology, and the working class, which describes the vast majority of society, most of whom are not socialists. And in fact, the purpose of a socialist organization is not just to impart knowledge from on high, this sort of special socialist knowledge that we have. It's a very specific task, which is to engage in concerted activity to create scenarios in which working class people can develop class consciousness on their own. And that means, and if you think that that's something that should happen, you can be a part of that by joining a socialist organization. That's really the only institution, to my mind, that can get the job done. And I'll end with an illustration of what I mean. There is currently, coming out of the Bernie 2020 campaign, there are Democratic Socialists of America members are taking to heart this idea that it's really, like he said, not me, us. And so many of them are not content to simply say, Bernie Sanders says, pour your energy into electing Joe Biden. And they say, thank you for your service, Bernie Sanders. Love you, but actually we have other things to do. There's a pandemic happening, and there's an economic crisis happening right now as well. And there are lots of people who are experiencing problems in their workplace. And because we have a very low unionization rate in this country, a lot of those people don't have protection, and they don't have time to build a union right now when they need to win concessions from their bosses in order to stay healthy or even survive. So Democratic Socialists of America members have linked up with a progressive union, the United Electrical Workers, and they're working together to do outreach to workers who don't belong to unions. And they're fielding calls, and they've fielded 700 plus calls at this point from people in workplaces all around the country who are not unionized, who are facing pandemic-related workplace issues right now. And the idea is to help these workers, link them up, like give them logistical support and help link them up with resources so that they can actually wage those fights on their own. Why is Democratic Socialists of America doing this? It's because it's full of socialists. And socialists believe that it's necessary to take advantage of opportunities in which working class people can on their own develop class consciousness, and in particular to keep your finger on the pulse and to see where that's already happening, and to volunteer your time and your energy to making it as making that opportunity actually realized in the real world. So that's called the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, and I think it's a really good example of what I'm talking about. It's not, the idea is not for, on these intake calls that DSA volunteers are doing, there's no, here's what you should think. Here's what socialists think. This is what you should think. It's like you are the person who knows about your workplace, and you are fired up and ready to fight your boss, and I'm going to help you do that, because that's the only path forward. It's not a sort of like vanguardist approach to like, I'm the keeper of the socialist knowledge and I am hereby imparting it to you. No, it's about creating situations in which working class people can develop their own class consciousness and wage class struggle on their own. That's all I have to say for now. And I think Micah's going to jump back in here. I know he has tons to say on this topic too, so I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about it. Thank you all for tuning in.
Great. Thank you, Megan. So as a reminder, that is Meagan Day. Meagan Day is a staff writer for Jacobin, as well as a co-author with me of a recent book called Bigger Than Bernie: How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. We're going to turn it over to questions from our audience in just a second. I haven't gotten a ton of questions on the chat. The chat is very active right now, but there's not a lot of questions in there. So feel free to throw some questions out for Megan that we will get to in a second. And remember, please, again, if you would be so kind, hit that subscribe button to the Jacobin channel. We're doing these stay-at-home videos almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern. And have a bunch of video content coming your way on that channel. So you'll get it if you hit subscribe and also like this video. So Megan, you just gave the pitch for joining a socialist organization, and it was a largely intellectual one. It was a good one, but you and I, at the end of our book and the conclusion, and I think you wrote most of the conclusion, so it's mostly you, wax kind of personally about what being in a socialist organization has meant to you. You love quoting that Eugene Debs quote that Bernie Sanders himself has also quoted in the past about gaining the ecstasy in the hand clasp of a comrade through the socialist movement. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, beyond all of the, an unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms, and we need to merge the working class movement and the socialist movement. What has it meant for you personally to join the socialist movement? You joined when everybody else in DSA, including me, joined after Bernie's first campaign and after Trump's election. What has your participation in this movement meant to you on a personal level?
That's a really good question. And yeah, like we wrote about that in the book. And I want to hear from you too after this, Micah. I want to preface this by saying that it's important that you not join a socialist organization simply because you would like to have a beautiful and wonderful community, because then you're going to bolt the moment that you realize that there's actually some conflict in democratic organizations. You should join it because you want to advance the socialist struggle. That said, it's been the most meaningful experience of my entire life. Like people often say, the word comrade is like very reminiscent of, Stalin and gulags. And why would you want to associate yourself with that? First of all, comrade is an English word. The Russian word is tovarish. So this word predates Stalinism. And I remember it from watching Western movies when I was a kid. My family liked to watch Westerns, like guys who would cowboys who would ride out together on the range together, who had each other's lives in their hands, really. They'd call each other comrade. That's what that word means. It means people who are not just friends, people who are on a mission together and who protect each other and who love each other in a different way. And there really is no word for the people that I have met in the socialist movement other than comrade. They're not my friends. I mean, I have friends who are socialists, but it's the texture of the relationship is so different, to be honest. It's like it really is like people who recognize in each other that each other is committed to something bigger than themselves, and it's like there's a third entity in your relationship. And that entity is like your shared commitment to equality, to democracy, and your feeling of solidarity with each other. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I can only assume it's because you haven't yet joined a socialist organization or found the right one for you, because it's a commonly experienced phenomenon. And I will also say that aside from just the social aspect, there's also an individual aspect, which is that everybody wants to live a life of meaning. It's neither a good nor a bad desire. It's a natural human desire, I think. And many people seek meaning in their lives through individual means. And that means, advancing their personal careers, or if they're unable to advance their careers, at the very least, taking care of their personal problems and taking a lot of pride in being able to take care of their personal problems. And I think that there's a different kind of meaning making that happens when you decide that you're going to commit yourself to a project that's not just purely individual, that is in fact collective, and not just collective, but also one that's going to last probably beyond your lifetime. I mean, I don't personally expect to see the socialist utopia transpire in my lifetime, and committing myself to a project that will continue after me, and where I assume that people will be waging this kind of struggle after I'm gone, and I will feel connected to them across the ages, right? As people of all different generations and even different timelines, people whose lives don't even overlap, who are committed to the same ideals. It helps you create meaning in your life that I think is actually very nourishing and very sustaining. And so I think that that is a good argument for why you should consider joining a socialist organization. Though, like I said, you should not, it's not therapy and it's not just a friend group. But yes, it's a very, very meaningful experience. Micah, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, we know that part of neoliberalism is not all of the stuff we always talk about: austerity, cutting budgets, privatization of public goods, but it's also a dismantling of the sense of the collective, of collective institutions in our society, and an emphasis on the individual as consumer or as entrepreneur or whatever. I don't think that that is a great way to go about your life. Like, being mostly concerned with just your status and achievement as an individual. I mean, what we're doing, in addition to trying to, make political change happen in the world, is have a collective project that we, gain meaning from by being a part of it with each other. And I think your assessment of what it means to like be a comrade of someone is spot on. I mean, the people who I interact with in DSA, I mean, I view them with a certain kind of I don't know if reverence is the right word, but I'm thinking about when I engage with them, or what I try to keep in mind, especially when I'm like annoyed with some of them, is that these people are the people with whom I am. I've joined in this collective project to transform the world. These are people who have, through a variety of paths and for a variety of reasons, with a variety of ways of thinking about how to do this, have decided that they want to dedicate their lives to making social change happen. And so I have a certain reverence for anybody who has decided to make that kind of life commitment. And just like you, I've had enormous meaning come out of my own personal life, and the kind of an intensity of experience with people on working on such a project that I don't really have anything in comparison to in the rest of my life. So I'm going to go to some of the questions here and maybe throw in some of my own while we're talking. One of the very first questions was somebody, I don't know if they were joking or not, but they asked, "Who's the next Bernie?" And it's a good question, because we saw how transformative the Bernie Sanders campaign was. I would venture saying that we wouldn't be in DSA. There would not be a reborn socialist movement in the United States without the Bernie Sanders campaign. And so people have understood how important a figure like Bernie is in a strong and fighting left. How would you respond to that question? I mean, on my end, I'm like, of course we need a figure like Bernie, a new figure like Bernie. We need one too many Bernies, but we also can't just be searching for that singular like figurehead of the movement, right? Like the part of the point of saying that huge numbers of people should join DSA is because maybe that'll help produce the next Bernie Sanders, but it'll also help produce the next group of rank and file teachers who will go on strike, or the next socialist militant who works at Amazon, who shuts down the warehouse when there's a pandemic going on and the company won't provide for them. I mean, we need to be searching for more than just who the next Bernie is, but also who this next generation of like rank and file, grassroots movement level fighters are going to come out of, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like, we have to first, in order to answer this question, we need to define our terms. Who's the next Bernie? Okay, what is Bernie? What is the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders? It's this very singular phenomenon that transformed American political life. I want to back up to something that I said at the very beginning. I can't promise that transformation is going to deliver the change that we all know that we need. In fact, that is up to us. Like, we have to decide now whether or not, like I said, Bernie Sanders failed in addition to losing. So if we establish that Bernie is not just a person, but was a transformational episode in American political history, then who is the next Bernie, I would wager to say that's probably not going to be an individual running for president. It's probably going to be all of the people who like came together out of the Bernie Sanders campaign, who were radicalized, who were pulled further and further into the movements, and decided to devote their lives more and more to realizing the ideals that animated his campaign. And whatever those people are able to produce, whether that be in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years, or the next 10 years, that is the next Bernie, as in the next watershed moment, bringing us closer to the society that we deserve.
Getting some questions about the language of how we talk about socialism. I mean, we were just having a talk about comrades, and or even just the word socialism, right?
Right.
And you're right. When if you watch like old James Bond movies or something, the bad guy is always like referring to the bad Soviet villain is talking like, what, no, I'm a Comrade Bond or whatever. Like there is that association with Stalinism, the failed projects of authoritarian socialism over the 20th century. So, how would you say that you go about talking about socialism without being off-putting to people? What are the important things to think about in that regard? And this is a leading way to ask this question, but what are the things that are worth keeping of that, or taking back from that, from that history? I mean, I'm asking because, like, of course, comrade has this association, especially with older people, for Stalinism, but I also find it to be a word that is very specific, that means a very specific kind of relationship to other people who are within a socialist organization. That is, as you said, is not the same as being a friend. It describes something very specific, and I'm not ready to give that up. I'm ready. I'm actually want to like rebuild what comradeship means for the 21st century. So yeah, reflections on language and people being put off by terms like comrade or socialism. How do we talk
Mhm.
about those things without being off-putting?
I mean, we have to be cognizant of it, I think, because we need to be talking to as many ordinary people as possible. And we don't want to just like doom ourselves to irrelevancy by freaking people out from the jump. But I also think that we should not be overly cautious, because we should just understand that in reality, we've been given an enormous gift. I think that Fox News for the last like 15 years has been calling everything socialist that it doesn't like, and has actually like totally scored a goal on itself by detoxifying that term for everybody who exists left of center in the United States, or all the people who like don't vote but occasionally catch snippets of Fox News. I think that they've hastened actually the detoxification of this term, like its sort of evolution past its Cold War associations. They were sort of resting on their laurels, right? I think that they got a little too comfortable using the word socialism to describe whatever. I mean, literally to describe neoliberalism, not even like social democracy. And there are some on the left who look at the current situation and will be like, well, that's not real socialism. What Bernie Sanders stands for is not real socialism. What DSA stands for is not real socialism. Okay, you're just like giving back the gift that you were given. That's in my opinion. You're just like, I don't want this. You don't want the opportunity to redefine socialism on a mass stage for like a new generation or several generations of people. I think that we have to take advantage of the opportunity to use the word socialism. What we're seeing now is that, yeah, it comes with some liabilities, in particular some electoral liabilities, but not nearly as much as we were promised, actually. That's the real takeaway, is that like, is not that some people are still scared of socialism, is that we were promised that everyone was scared of socialism. And it turns out that that's actually not true. And so I think that we should not shy away from using that word. I think that, to be quite honest, democratic socialism is a term that I think is somewhat redundant, because socialism socialism is synonymous with democracy, and to the extent that socialist experiments have been undemocratic, I think they have let down those ideals of socialism, the democratic ideal of socialism. Uh, However, even though it's a little redundant, I don't think we should get hung up on it. Democratic socialism is it's a good and useful term because for one thing, it distances us from those undemocratic 20th century socialist experiments, which I think is just useful in terms of people can get into when you start to talk to people, you should probably not lead with like, well, Stalin did some stuff right. I think that there are nuances that we can discuss, but you probably shouldn't lead with that. And like, let's just bring them in the door first before we like freak people out. And so I think that, what was I saying?
Well, you were you were saying a bunch of stuff. You were talking
I was.
about democratic socialism.
Oh
I
yeah.
just want to respond to some of it. I want to say that
Yeah.
the democratic. It's important to talk about democratic
Yeah.
socialism because it is a specific tradition that one among multiple forms of doing socialism. I also think that I would disagree slightly with what you said about. I mean, yes, it is true that Stalinism is like a perversion of what I consider to be like at the real core of socialism. But I also don't think that we should say that like we should pretend that that is not a part of the history that we have to reckon with. Like there were authoritarian experiments that were carried out under the name of socialism, but I don't think that you need to get into too much of that with people, especially in 2020. Like people don't people for the reasons that you already mentioned. I mean, like when Fox News is calling every social democratic policy socialism, then people they're like, oh, well, that's what socialism is. It's not Stalinism. And I don't think anybody really believes that people like us are like trying to drag them into gulags. Like that's not going to happen. Let me get to some of these other questions here. There's a couple questions about electoral politics. One person was asking about how important local politics is to the socialist movement going forward. And maybe you're going to answer that question as well as just like if you can give a quick Cliff Notes version of the how elevator pitch on how socialists approach electoral politics generally.
Yeah, sure. So I want to make sure that this like stays in the purview of the like why you should join a socialist organization. So I'm going to try to combine the two. Local politics is neutral. It can be good or it can be like irrelevant and pointless. I think that if you are actually though, if you are a part of a socialist organizations can do electoral politics differently because socialist organizations, like I said, are year round, 24/7, 365 organizing operations, at least if they're running at the capacity that they ought to be. And they have to reach a critical mass to run at that capacity. But a lot of DSA chapters are already there. Whether or not we want to talk about are people doing the right stuff is separate, but they're at that capacity and they're doing sort of non-electoral organizing whenever there's not an election season. And for that reason, running electoral campaigns through a socialist organization like a DSA chapter is actually a really good way to not just try to put one of your people in office, though I think that's really important, and we can talk about that separately. But it's also a really good way to strengthen your socialist organization, to learn new skills, to develop new confidence, to make new relationships, to build new internal infrastructure that you can put to use on whatever campaign comes next. And the best example I have for that comes from my DSA chapter, East Bay DSA, which helped run a campaign for state assembly that was unsuccessful, but learned about a month before that campaign was over. And we came pretty close, by the way, on that campaign. It was a phenomenal campaign. That was Javanka Beckles for state assembly. About a month before it was over, we committed to helping the Oakland teachers go on strike, which we had just heard that they were going to do. And so we didn't collapse our campaign infrastructure. I mean, obviously we had to transition in a ton of ways, but basically all the same people stayed involved and like a ton of relationships had been made. There were people learned how to do things that they had never done before. Volunteers who are not political experts learned how to do stuff. And, we basically stopped campaigning for Javanka and started campaigning to build community support for the Oakland teachers strike well in advance of the strike itself, and ultimately ended up being the key community partner in OEA's, in the Oakland Education Association strike. And that was, there's not like you don't have to make a neat separation. In fact, you should not make a neat separation between electoral politics and movement politics. But if you don't have an organization that is devoted to both electoral and non-electoral work, then you're going to like run a campaign, and then when it's over, win or lose, whatever you built up over the course of that campaign is likely to dissipate and evaporate, which is a shame.
We have people in the chat watching this from all over the place. Somebody, Patrick Jarvalov. Hello, Patrick, from Sweden. He says hello from the Swedish Left Party, which is pretty cool. He's the only one, though, I think, in the chat who has announced where he's from, but I'm sure people from all over. We have a question here from our own comrade, Ella Mahoney, former coworker and always comrade Ella Mahoney. Why is it important to be part of a specifically socialist organization and not just unions or organizations generally advocating reforms that would be good for working class people? So I think this is a question that comes up a lot. For people who recognize that we need, stronger unions that can build working class power, that can raise wages, that can win really tangible material reforms for the working class to build working class power. Why should people spend their time at DSA meetings, involved in DSA campaigns, rather than just spending their every waking moment of their activism on stuff like building a union in their workplace? Why do you need both of them?
I mean, you should work on, if you have the ability to build a union in your workplace, you should consider doing that. And it takes a lot of time and energy, and that may just end up being what you do for a stretch. But I know people who have, who are very involved in their unions, who are in my DSA chapter, and for them, it's like critically important to have people to come and discuss the challenges that they're facing in the process of organizing the workplace or maintaining their union. And this was a great question, by the way, Ella. And Ella's who the word comrade was invented for. Hi, Ella. And I think, when you're, so these other institutions, and all institutions, but an institution like a union has some structural limitations, even as we recognize that it's critically important and we need to build a very powerful labor movement. We need to build good militant fighting unions. But it is also the case that especially when the labor movement is weak, unions find themselves in a position where they're kind of fighting for their survival, and there's a tendency for those who lead the union to kind of play mediator between the workers and the boss. That's just a natural tendency that arises, in particular when the labor movement is weak. And so if you want to avoid those pitfalls, which are very common, being in a socialist organization is a great way to work through problems with people who share your broader, class political perspective. And it's also a great way to build relationships with other people who are in other unions to troubleshoot stuff with. And it's also a phenomenal way to tap into a vast reservoir of volunteers who can help you whenever your union is actually ready to take aggressive or militant action, and you really need some people on the dialer or on the doors, or you need people to come out and stand on the picket line, or people to do social media for you. I mean, you have this incredible volunteer base right at your disposal of people who understand that this is how they should be spending their time, but might not have heard about your union struggle otherwise. So I hope those are a few good examples. I bet Micah has more, though.
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, it is very important for socialists to be part of organizing unions in particular, and be members of other kinds of social movements, and not just because not in order to somehow steal a slice of the membership of your local chapter of the Sunrise Movement or whatever and turn them into DSA members. It's important for socialists to participate as actual good faith members of these social movements with the intention of actually building them, because we of course recognize how essential it is to build those movements, in particular the labor movement. Sam Gindin, who writes for Jacobin quite a bit, is a longtime leftist, talks about how we need to have a left that has both one foot in the labor movement and one foot outside of it. In my own experience, when I have not been deeply involved in the labor movement or in other social movement struggles, and I've just been engaged in socialist work, I allow myself to sort of my one foot is not in the labor movement, and the other foot is it's floating above the earth. I'm not actually rooted in what is actually going on in social movements in the labor movement, and that that's not a good situation for someone who wants to figure out how to change the world to be in. On the other hand, I've also had times in my life where I was fully engaged in the labor movement, throwing my every waking hour into the labor movement, and thought that any kind of wrestling with questions about socialism or other bigger picture ideological questions were a kind of distraction from the quote unquote real work of building unions. And in those moments, when you throw yourself entirely into such movement building, you can allow yourself to kind of drift rightward with the demands of being in building a union, or being in the union, and maintaining it, that you can lose your higher ideals beyond just the kind of bread and butter gains that we know are so critical for socialists to be fighting for, but also to build something that goes beyond that, beyond just building a strong movement that can win strong contracts for workers, and actually fight for a different and much better world. And so we need to be doing both, and you don't want to be caught on too far on either side of that divide, either like drifting into a kind of sectarianism that isn't rooted in real life, or drifting so far into labor work without without a real left that's independent of it, to have that broader vision, and to there are many examples within the labor movement of people who spend their whole lives in it, and it allows them to, they give up on things like going on strike. They forget that worker power actually comes from a willingness to take action on the job. They are so focused on building in their own workplace or in their own industry that they forget that the job, from a socialist perspective, the proper job of a union is not just to fight for its own members, but to fight for the entire working class, to be a vehicle to fight for broader changes beyond just the people who pay dues to your union. So we need both of those things very desperately. And I would say that if you join DSA, being a member of a socialist organization, there's no danger that you won't be pushed towards being deeply involved in those actual struggles. Like that is what DSA, every major important struggle that is happening out there right now in the United States and around the world, DSA is deeply involved in. So you join the organization, you'll be pushed to get your hands dirty in the real world. We're running out of time here, so why don't we just talk about what, as we've mentioned, the Bernie campaign is now over. What is it? What are Democratic Socialists going to be involved in here from here on out? What campaigns will DSA and Socialists, post Bernie, be working on? It's felt like so far, over the last year especially, that all eyes were on the Bernie Sanders campaign. Many of us were throwing everything we could into that campaign. I know you were going to multiple states to knock on doors for Bernie. I was as well. And now that's over. And so where do we go from here? And how do we balance the need to, do electoral campaigns or do workplace organizing? Like, how do we figure out what the agenda for the Democratic Socialist movement is post Bernie?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that one thing that we're very fortunate to have inherited from the now over Bernie Sanders 5-year-long campaign for president is a popular platform. And we've been able to see how people respond to that platform. And I think that that platform kind of provides like a very useful roadmap to the kinds of things that we would want to be advancing through one means or another. So that's the first piece of it, is that Medicare for all, tuition-free college, homes guarantee, like expanded public housing and rent control and so on, Green New Deal, debt cancellation, beefed up unions and clearing obstacles for unions. I think Bernie had it as doubling union membership. And of course, raising the minimum wage. These are all things that we now have, like we've basically done a structure test on them, and we can now see that millions of people are in fact hungry for them and are responding very well to them in varying degrees, but overall very positively. Like when I say varying degrees, I mean like obviously Medicare for all is a huge huge winner, right? People understand that it is like probably the most egregious example that impinges on the most people's personal lives of capitalism, just like exploiting people and grinding them into dust for profit. So I think we should be serious about the platform that that he ran on, and we should take it to heart, and we should factor it into our strategy going forward. As for the actual strategy, I think that there are two, to be very crude about it, there are two buckets, and I hope that I've explained that I don't think that these are mutually exclusive, and in fact, work in either sphere would be insufficient if you thought that it was exclusive from the other sphere. But they are, broadly speaking, electoral politics and social movement work with a special emphasis on the labor movement. I think that we should continue to run electoral campaigns. I don't necessarily think that we should be super focused on presidential campaigns because there's not a deep bench. We might just not have the option to do that for a minute. That doesn't mean that we should sit around on our hands. We should be running electoral campaigns for many of the reasons that I mentioned before, in terms of like building up our own capacity, but also because people pay attention to electoral politics. People pay the most attention to presidential politics, but if you don't have someone who can really serve your movement by running for president, like readily available, then there are still opportunities for you in state politics and local politics to give you a pretext to knock on doors and have conversations with people about the actual problems that they're facing in their lives and who's responsible for them, and help sort of transform consciousness that way. And then also to locate people through that who are already like pretty ideologically similar to you, and to bring them further into your organization, and maybe make socialists out of them, by getting involved in what people who are passionate about changing the world are often involved in, which is electoral politics. I think that there are specific ways that you can go about electoral politics, and if you don't follow certain guidelines, you're very likely to lapse into what's known as electoralism, which is not the same as electoral politics. Electoralism describes when you want to install your people in office because you think that's how change is made, just to the detriment of everything else. But like once your people are in there, they're gonna like, you get enough of them, and then they work together and they pass the laws, and like, yeah, you did it. That we're not doing that. We have like a much more nuanced view of what the purpose of an elected official who wins is to begin with, but also while you should absolutely run to win, it's also the case that if you don't win, you can still what did I say earlier? I said, like, this is from you, Micah. Bernie Sanders lost, but it's not inevitable that he failed. This is the same principle can be applied to down ballot races if you run them in such a way that actually builds your capacity for class struggle. I hope that the example that I gave of what happened in the East Bay and being able to kind of flip it around and do labor solidarity work directly on the heels of our electoral campaign can suffice as a kind of example of what I'm talking about. And Mike and I wrote a book together. I'm not sure, have we even mentioned that? So
I always, take the chance to mention it. We have mentioned it.
Okay, well, Micah and I wrote a book together. It's called Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. And if you are interested in more like specific guidelines for how to engage, how we think that socialists should engage through their socialist organizations in electoral politics, you can find that in the book, but I won't ramble on too long about it. And then the second category is just in social movement work, whether that's movements around, for example, housing reform, or building the labor movement and struggles in the workplace. And we also have details about how we think that socialist organizations and socialists through their organizations can go about engaging in that regard too. But I think Micah summed it up pretty well in your last comment, at least as relates to the labor movement.
You can get that book for the low price of $12.95 at jacobinmag.com/store. Megan, where else are you going to be able to get a hardback book, brand new, for $12.95? It escapes me where you could such a deal. Only at jacobinmag.com. Thank you for everyone for watching. Again, we are doing these nearly every night, 6 p.m. Eastern. And we're not asking people for money or anything like that, but we do want you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please share the video once it's up. Share. We've now done a couple dozen of these. You can go back and watch on a wide variety of topics. So go check them out, share them if you like them, and like them if you like them. And we will be back again on Monday with Jared Abbott and Tuesday with Dustin Guastella. They are going to be discussing their 2 co-written articles in our journal Catalyst, as well as the last print issue of Jacobin, on the question of a party surrogate as a part of a socialist strategy. So Megan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Micah. Thank you.
Thank you.